the book of Mark is actually a really fascinating book of all the four Gospels. In fact, for a long time, it was often considered the lesser gospel to the Gospel of Matthew for a very long time. And yet, it's important to kind of look at the structure of Mark and figure out where does it fit. And it was really since about 1900 from Reed, who made the first kind of comment of saying maybe this is really the first gospel, given its structure, given the approach there that it's looking at. It's not maybe as complete as the Gospel of Matthew. It's not as nice, beautiful wording as the Gospel of Luke. But there seems to be a lot of roots to it that say this is probably the earliest of the Gospels. And so probably I'd say at this point, more than a century later, it's pretty much accepted that this is the first written gospel. And it's a very interesting kind of flavor of which Mark is talking. It is a very fast-paced storytelling. And I want to look at the structure a little bit, but a couple things show up very quickly when you look at the structure. One, notice that it has 16 chapters. The 16th chapter is kind of small, but a heavy amount is tied to the Passion Week. So going from what we now know as Palm Sunday, the Palm Sunday kind of behavior, all the way through to the burial of Jesus. That is a huge percentage of the book. What we do not have is we do not have any stories around Jesus' birth or his early life. We just almost nothing about John the Baptist, and we just kind of get going into the ministry. In fact, it's a very fast-paced storytelling all the way through. Another thing that we see that comes through this, and this comes also back from Reed originally, is that you have this what's called messianic secret. Jesus keeps telling people, hey, don't tell anybody who I am, which is a fairly fascinating perspective of like, he's doing all these amazing things, but telling everyone, hey, don't say anything. But it's very, very interesting to kind of look at this. I really do like looking at the Gospels and kind of looking at a graphical structure of over the various chapters, going from 1 to 16. It is 16 chapters. That's kind of, by the way, the original document did not have chapter designations. This is something that happened much, much later. And you begin to, certain things sort of immediately come out as you look at this. One of which is you see a huge amount of focus on the Passion Week. You see also another sort of center focus in the middle of where Jesus is foretelling of his death and his resurrection. This is very, very important all the way throughout. And you see that that's actually what leads up to that is all of the, basically, I'm going to say the feeding miracles, the feeding of the 4,000 and the feeding of the 5,000. These are sort of core things that kind of pivot the story all the way through. And so you see a couple of these parts, and this sort of one of the things that joins this first point here is being asked by Jesus, being asked to Peter and the whole disciples, who do you say that I am? And Peter then says, oh, you are the Christ. And that turns out to turn everything. And so this becomes a very interesting kind of conversation and approach to looking at this. Now, there's a question of like, well, what's going on here? And what people have kind of looked at this and have talked about is like, oh, this looks like, Jesus is kind of being an apprentice, has almost an apprenticeship to this. I mean, this is sort of using Dallas Willard's words for this, or maybe a mentorship. I like to think about it in terms of it feels a lot like modern day graduate school, particularly for those who have ever gone through a PhD program. That mentorship, kind of walking with a teacher for many years, is very, very typical. And so I kind of like to think of it in those terms. And you might ask, well, how does that make sense? Well, if you think about it, this book of Mark, probably written early enough to be written by Mark, you begin to realize that Jesus was this amazing teacher to Peter and the disciples and always sort of sits above everybody else. Peter was this amazing teacher to Mark, and Mark, of course, also knew of Paul and others. And then Mark ended up being this incredible teacher to others in Rome. And so as a result, what you see is something pretty cool. That you have basically one person being an amazing teacher to another, being an amazing teacher to another. And those who've gone through graduate school kind of understand a little what's happening here. Because when you start, you're always overwhelmed, and you're always seeming like you're always making mistakes. You're always the metaphor used today is drinking through a fire hose at first. And then eventually you start to develop, you start to succeed, you start to grow, you start to get past that. And this seems to be a really good way to think about what's happening in the Gospel of Mark, and of one particular perspective, of one of what we have today as four canonical Gospels, and its perspective over these cases.